Hey guys, tonight we journey back to one of history's most haunting questions. How does the mightiest empire the world had ever seen simply vanish? For over 1,000 years, Rome stood as the eternal city, the beating heart of civilization itself. Its legions marched across 3 continents. Its roads stretched to the edges of the known world, and its power seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. But empires, no matter how mighty, are built by human hands. And human hands, as we'll discover tonight, can make mistakes so catastrophic they echo through the centuries. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because what we're about to explore isn't just the fall of an empire. It's the story of how one decision, made with the best of intentions, became the fatal mistake that destroyed Rome forever. Picture this. The year is 753 before the Common Era. On 7 hills beside the muddy Tiber River, a collection of shepherds and farmers are about to change the world forever. They don't know it yet, of course. They're too busy surviving, fighting off raiders, and arguing over whose goats belong to whom. But something is stirring in these rough settlements. Call it ambition, call it destiny, call it the simple human refusal to accept that this is all there is. These people, these early Romans, are developing something that will reshape civilization itself, an unshakable belief that they are meant for greatness. The legend tells us that Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, twin brothers raised by wolves. It's a beautiful story, full of divine intervention and mythic purpose. But the truth is probably messier and more human. Rome wasn't born from legend. It was born from necessity, from the grinding reality of survival in a world where the strong devoured the weak. What made these early Romans different wasn't their strength or their numbers. It was their mindset. While other tribes fought for territory or treasure, the Romans fought for something bigger, the idea that they could build something permanent, something that would outlast their own brief lives. They developed a culture built on discipline, sacrifice, and an almost religious devotion to the state. Roman children learned that individual glory meant nothing if it didn't serve Rome. Roman soldiers swore oaths that bound them not just to their commanders, but to the eternal city itself. Roman citizens, even the poorest among them, carried themselves with the pride of people who belonged to something greater than themselves. This wasn't just patriotism. This was something deeper, something that bordered on the mystical. Romans believed, with every fiber of their being, that they were chosen by the gods to rule the world, not to conquer it and abandon it, but to civilize it, to bring order to chaos, to transform barbarian lands into provinces of the eternal empire. And for centuries, this belief seemed justified. Roman legions marched north into Gaul, south into Africa, east into Asia. Everywhere they went, they didn't just conquer, they built. Roads that lasted millennia, aqueducts that brought fresh water to cities hundreds of miles away, forums and theaters and baths that turned rough frontier towns into centers of civilization. The Roman way wasn't just about military might. It was about transformation. When Rome conquered a people, it didn't just demand tribute. It offered citizenship, law, protection, and the chance to become part of something magnificent. The Roman Empire wasn't just a collection of conquered territories. It was an idea made manifest. The idea that human beings could create order, justice, and prosperity on a scale never before imagined. By the 1st century of the Common Era, this dream had become reality. Roman law governed from Britain to Mesopotamia. Roman roads carried merchants and messages across 3 continents. Roman peace, the famous Pax Romana, had ended centuries of warfare and brought stability to millions of people who had never known it before. But here's the thing about dreams, especially dreams as grand as Rome's. They require constant tending. They demand sacrifice, vigilance, and above all, unity of purpose. The moment that unity cracks, the moment Romans begin to see themselves as individuals rather than servants of the eternal city, the dream begins to die. And by the 3rd century, cracks were already showing. The empire had grown so vast that it strained under its own weight. The legions that had once been Rome's greatest strength were now scattered across thousands of miles of frontier, fighting endless wars against enemies who seemed to multiply like weeds. The treasury that had once overflowed with the wealth of the world was being drained by the constant need to pay soldiers, build fortifications, and maintain the vast machinery of imperial government. But the Romans of the 3rd century still believed. They still carried within them that ancient conviction that Rome was eternal, that the empire would endure forever, that temporary setbacks were just that, temporary. They couldn't imagine a world without Rome, because for them, Rome wasn't just a city, or even an empire. It was civilization itself. They were about to learn that even the mightiest dreams can become nightmares. And the nightmare was already taking shape in the mind of a man who thought he was saving the empire, when in fact he was about to make the one decision that would destroy it forever. To understand how Rome fell, we first need to understand what Rome was supposed to be. For nearly 500 years, Rome wasn't an empire at all. It was a republic, a revolutionary idea that power should belong not to kings, but to the people and their elected representatives. The Roman Republic was born from a promise. Never again would Romans bow to a tyrant. In 509 before the Common Era, they had driven out their last king, Tarquin the Proud, and sworn a sacred oath that no single man would ever again hold absolute power over Rome. They created a system of checks and balances that would have impressed the American founding fathers. 2 consuls shared executive power, each able to veto the other. The Senate provided wisdom and continuity. The people's assemblies gave voice to the common citizen. For centuries, this system worked brilliantly. It channeled Roman ambition into collective achievement. When Romans conquered new territories, they did so not for the glory of a single ruler, but for the glory of the republic itself. The spoils of war enriched not just the generals, but the state. The expansion of Roman power meant the expansion of Roman law, Roman citizenship, Roman civilization. But success, as we'll see again and again in this story, can be its own poison. As Rome grew richer and more powerful, the temptations grew stronger. Why share power when you could hold it all? Why serve the state when the state could serve you? The first cracks appeared in the 2nd century before the Common Era. Roman generals, returning from successful campaigns in Greece and Asia, brought back not just gold and slaves, but dangerous new ideas about power. They had seen how Eastern kings lived, surrounded by luxury and worshipped as gods. They had tasted the intoxicating drug of absolute authority. The brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus tried to reform the system, to redistribute land to Rome's growing population of landless poor. They were murdered for their efforts, their bodies thrown into the Tiber River. The message was clear. The old ways were dying, and violence was becoming the new language of Roman politics. Then came Marius and Sulla, 2 generals who turned the Roman army from a citizen militia into a professional force loyal not to the state, but to whoever paid their wages. They fought a civil war that tore the Republic apart, each claiming to be its savior while actually hastening its destruction. But it was Julius Caesar who delivered the killing blow. Brilliant, charismatic, and utterly ruthless, Caesar understood that the Republic was already dead. The question wasn't whether Rome would have a dictator, but who that dictator would be. In 49 before the Common Era, he crossed the Rubicon River with his legions, marching on Rome itself. "The die is cast," he reportedly said, and with those words, the Roman Republic breathed its last. Caesar's assassination on the Ides of March, 44 before the Common Era, was supposed to restore the Republic. Instead, it plunged Rome into another round of civil wars that lasted 13 more years. When the smoke finally cleared, Caesar's adopted son Octavian stood alone as master of the Roman world. But Octavian was cleverer than his adoptive father. He understood that Romans still cherished the memory of the Republic, still believed in the old ideals of shared power and collective responsibility. So he didn't call himself king or dictator. He took the modest title of Augustus, the revered one, and claimed to be merely the first citizen of a restored republic. It was a beautiful lie, and Romans embraced it eagerly because they wanted to believe it. Augustus kept the forms of republican government while gutting its substance. The Senate still met, but only to rubber stamp his decisions. Elections still took place, but only candidates he approved could win. The people still assembled, but only to cheer his speeches. And for a while, it worked magnificently. Augustus brought peace after decades of civil war. He reformed the army, the administration, the tax system. He built roads and aqueducts and monuments that proclaimed Roman greatness to the world. Under his rule, Rome entered its golden age, the era of the Pax Romana that would last for 2 centuries. But the price of this peace was the death of the republican spirit that had made Rome great in the first place. Romans were no longer citizens participating in their own government. They were subjects, dependent on the wisdom and benevolence of their emperor. The old Roman virtues of civic duty, personal responsibility, and collective sacrifice began to wither. Worse still, the imperial system created a fundamental problem that would plague Rome for the next 4 centuries: the succession crisis. In a republic, power passed through elections. In a monarchy, it passed through bloodlines. But the Roman Empire was neither fish nor fowl. It was a monarchy pretending to be a republic, which meant there was no clear, legitimate way to choose the next emperor. Some emperors tried to solve this by adopting capable heirs. Others relied on the loyalty of the army. Still others hoped their own sons would prove worthy. But again and again, the death of an emperor plunged Rome into civil war as rival claimants fought for the purple. By the 3rd century, the situation had become catastrophic. In the 50 years between 235 and 284 of the Common Era, Rome had 26 emperors. Most died violent deaths. Some ruled for only a few months before being murdered by their own soldiers or rivals. The empire was literally tearing itself apart. This was the world that Diocletian inherited when he seized power in 284. The empire was bankrupt. The army was demoralized. The frontiers were crumbling under barbarian pressure. Inflation had destroyed the currency. Plague had devastated the population. The very idea of Roman invincibility lay in ruins. Diocletian was a soldier's soldier, a man who had risen from humble origins through sheer competence and determination. He looked at the chaos around him and made a decision that seemed, at the time, like pure genius. If the empire was too big for one man to rule effectively, why not divide it? Why not create a system where multiple emperors could share the burden? It was logical. It was practical. It addressed the immediate crisis with surgical precision. And it was the beginning of the end for Rome itself. Before we dive into Diocletian's fateful decision, we need to understand what Rome had become by the 3rd century. This wasn't the lean, hungry republic that had conquered the Mediterranean through discipline and sacrifice. This was something entirely different. An empire drunk on its own success, bloated with wealth, and increasingly disconnected from the virtues that had made it great. The transformation had been gradual, almost imperceptible. Each generation of Romans lived a little better than the last. Each emperor tried to outdo his predecessors in magnificence. Each victory brought new treasures, new luxuries, new ways to demonstrate Roman superiority over the barbarian world. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, Rome had become the greatest consumer society in human history. The city itself housed over 1 million people, making it larger than London would be until the 18th century. These weren't productive citizens in the old republican sense. Many were unemployed masses dependent on free grain distributions and elaborate public entertainments. Bread and circuses, the poet Juvenal called it, and he meant it as a criticism. The Roman people, once the backbone of the republic's citizen soldiers, had been transformed into a mob that cared more about free food and spectacular games than about the health of the state. They had traded their civic responsibilities for comfort and entertainment. The emperors were happy to make this trade. A well-fed, entertained population was a docile population. Why risk the dangers of republican participation when you could simply give the people what they wanted? The Colosseum, completed under Emperor Titus in 80 of the Common Era, could hold 50,000 spectators for gladiatorial games that lasted for days. The Circus Maximus could accommodate 250,000 people for chariot races. These weren't just entertainments. They were political tools, ways of demonstrating imperial power and keeping the masses happy. An emperor who provided spectacular games was a successful emperor, regardless of his actual competence at governing. The people cheered for blood and spectacle while the empire slowly rotted from within. The rot was most visible in the army, once Rome's greatest strength. The legions that had conquered Gaul and Britain were citizen soldiers who fought for Rome because Rome was their home, their identity, their sacred trust. But by the 3rd century, fewer and fewer Romans were willing to serve in the military. Why risk death on some distant frontier when you could live comfortably in the city on government handouts? So the emperors did what seemed logical. They hired barbarians to do the fighting for them. Germanic tribes, Sarmatian cavalry, Gothic warriors, all were welcomed into Roman service as long as they could hold a sword and follow orders. These foederati, as they were called, were often excellent soldiers, but they weren't Romans. They had no deep loyalty to Roman civilization, no emotional investment in Roman success. This created a vicious cycle. The more Rome relied on barbarian soldiers, the less Roman the army became. The less Roman the army became, the more it resembled just another barbarian warband that happened to fight under Roman standards. And barbarian warbands, as history repeatedly demonstrated, had a tendency to turn on their employers when the pay stopped coming, or a better offer appeared. The economic foundations of the empire were equally shaky. Rome had grown rich through conquest, but by the 2nd century there were no more wealthy kingdoms left to conquer. The empire had reached its natural limits, bounded by deserts, forests, and oceans that offered little profit for the enormous cost of conquest. Without new sources of wealth, Rome had to live off what it already possessed. But the Roman economy was fundamentally extractive. It was designed to funnel wealth from the provinces to the center, not to create new wealth through innovation or productivity. Roman technology had stagnated. Roman agriculture was inefficient. Roman manufacturing couldn't compete with cheaper goods from India and China. The result was a slow-motion economic crisis that lasted for centuries. To pay for the army, the bureaucracy, and the endless public works projects that kept the people happy, emperors debased the currency, mixing silver coins with cheaper metals until they were worth a fraction of their face value. Inflation soared, trade declined. The middle class, the backbone of any healthy society, was squeezed out of existence. By the 3rd century, Roman society had polarized into two extremes: a tiny elite of fantastically wealthy aristocrats and a vast mass of impoverished dependents. The old Roman middle class of farmers, artisans, and merchants had largely disappeared, replaced by slaves and barbarian settlers who had no stake in Roman civilization. This wasn't just an economic problem, it was a spiritual crisis. The Romans of the 3rd century had lost touch with the values that had made their ancestors great. They no longer believed in sacrifice for the common good. They no longer saw themselves as part of something larger and more important than their individual desires. The old Roman religion, with its emphasis on duty to the state and the gods, was giving way to mystery cults and foreign philosophies that promised personal salvation rather than civic virtue. Christianity was spreading rapidly, offering hope to the oppressed, but also teaching that earthly kingdoms were temporary and that true loyalty belonged to a heavenly city, not to Rome. Even the emperors themselves had changed. The early emperors, whatever their faults, had at least maintained the pretense of being servants of the Roman people. But by the 3rd century, many emperors openly modeled themselves on Eastern despots, demanding to be worshipped as gods and surrounding themselves with the elaborate ceremonies of divine kingship. This was the world that Diocletian inherited, an empire that had forgotten what it meant to be Roman, an army that was more barbarian than Roman, an economy that was slowly collapsing under its own weight, and a people who had traded their birthright of citizenship for the mess of pottage that was bread and circuses. Something had to be done. The empire was too big, too complex, too unwieldy for any single man to govern effectively. The frontiers were under constant pressure from barbarian tribes who were themselves being pushed westward by even more dangerous enemies. The army was overstretched and unreliable. The treasury was empty. Diocletian's solution seemed brilliant in its simplicity. Divide the empire into manageable pieces, each ruled by a competent emperor who could focus on his own region's problems. It was a rational response to an impossible situation. But rationality, as we're about to see, isn't always wisdom. Sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease. And sometimes, in trying to save something, you end up destroying the very thing that made it worth saving in the first place. To understand why Diocletian made his fateful decision, we need to grasp the sheer impossibility of governing the Roman Empire by the late 3rd century. Imagine trying to rule a territory that stretched from Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the cataracts of the Nile in Egypt, from the Atlantic shores of Portugal to the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. Now imagine trying to do it with the communication technology of the ancient world. A message from Rome to the Rhine frontier took at least a month to arrive, assuming good weather and safe roads. A message to the eastern provinces could take 2 months or more. By the time an emperor in Rome learned of a crisis on the frontier, the situation had usually changed completely. By the time his orders arrived, they were often irrelevant or counterproductive. This communication lag created a fundamental problem. Local commanders had to make crucial decisions without imperial guidance, but they lacked the authority to make those decisions legitimately. The result was a constant tension between the need for quick action and the requirements of imperial protocol. The military situation was even worse. The Roman Empire had approximately 9,000 miles of frontier to defend, much of it against enemies who were becoming increasingly sophisticated and aggressive. The old strategy of maintaining a thin line of border fortifications backed by mobile reserves was breaking down under the pressure of coordinated barbarian attacks. The Goths had learned to build ships and were raiding the coasts of the Black Sea and the Aegean. The Alemanni were pressing against the Rhine frontier with new tactics and weapons. The Sassanid Persians had revived their empire and were challenging Roman control of Mesopotamia with professional armies that rivaled Rome's own legions. But the most dangerous enemies weren't the barbarians at the gates. They were the Romans themselves. The 3rd century had seen the empire torn apart by civil wars as rival generals fought for the imperial throne. These weren't just political disputes. They were existential struggles that diverted resources from frontier defense and invited barbarian invasion. The mathematics of imperial defense were brutal. Rome needed approximately 400,000 soldiers to defend its frontiers adequately. But the empire's population was declining due to plague, warfare, and economic disruption. Fewer people meant fewer potential soldiers, which meant greater reliance on barbarian foederati, which meant less reliable defense, which meant more invasions, which meant more disruption, which meant fewer people. It was a death spiral. The economic burden was equally crushing. Maintaining the army consumed roughly 75% of the imperial budget. Add in the cost of the bureaucracy, public works, and the grain dole for Rome's population, and the empire was spending far more than it could sustainably raise in taxes. Emperors tried various solutions. They debased the currency, creating inflation that destroyed savings and disrupted trade. They raised taxes, driving more people into poverty and reducing the tax base. They confiscated property from the wealthy, creating a climate of fear that discouraged investment and innovation. None of it worked. The empire was caught in a trap of its own making. It was too big to govern effectively, but too committed to its existing structure to reform itself. Every solution created new problems. Every attempt to strengthen one part of the empire weakened another. The situation was made worse by the empire's success in earlier centuries. Roman law, Roman administration, Roman culture had spread throughout the Mediterranean world, creating a unified civilization that was genuinely impressive. But this very success made it impossible to abandon any part of the empire without seeming to betray the Roman mission itself. How could Rome abandon Britain, where Roman civilization had flourished for 3 centuries? How could it give up Gaul, the source of so much wealth and so many soldiers? How could it retreat from the Danube, leaving Roman citizens to the mercy of barbarian raiders? Every province had its defenders, its local interests, its claims on imperial resources. Every frontier had its strategic importance, its role in the overall defense of the empire. There was no obvious place to draw a smaller, more defensible border. The emperors of the 3rd century tried various expedients. Some focused on the eastern frontier, leaving the west to fend for itself. Others concentrated on defending Italy and the western provinces while neglecting the east. A few attempted to maintain the entire frontier through sheer force of will and increasingly desperate measures. None of these approaches worked for long. The empire was simply too large and too complex for any single ruler to manage effectively. The problems were multiplying faster than solutions could be implemented. The center was losing control of the periphery, and the periphery was fragmenting into semi-independent regions ruled by local strongmen. By the time Diocletian seized power in 284, the empire had endured 50 years of near-constant crisis. The economy was in ruins, the army was demoralized and unreliable, the frontiers were crumbling. The very idea of Roman invincibility had been shattered by repeated defeats and humiliations. Something radical had to be done. The old system of unified imperial rule had clearly failed. The empire needed a new structure, a new approach, a new way of organizing itself for survival in an increasingly hostile world. Diocletian's solution was elegant in its logic. If the empire was too big for one man to rule, divide it among multiple rulers. Create a system where each emperor could focus on his own region, responding quickly to local crises without having to coordinate with distant colleagues. Maintain unity of purpose while allowing flexibility of execution. It seemed like the perfect answer to an impossible problem. And in the short term, it worked brilliantly. Diocletian's tetrarchy, his system of 4 co-emperors, brought stability to the empire for the first time in generations. The frontiers were secured, the economy was stabilized, the army was reformed and re-energized. But there was a hidden cost to this success, a price that wouldn't become apparent for several generations. In solving the immediate crisis of imperial governance, Diocletian had planted the seeds of a much larger disaster. He had taken the first step down a path that would lead inexorably to the destruction of the Roman Empire itself. The fatal mistake wasn't obvious at the time. It seemed like wisdom, like necessary adaptation to change circumstances. But history has a way of revealing the true consequences of our decisions, often long after we're gone to see them. And the consequences of Diocletian's decision would echo through the centuries, shaping the fate of civilization itself. The year was 285 of the Common Era. Diocletian, a soldier who had risen from humble origins in Dalmatia, stood at the pinnacle of Roman power. But the empire he had inherited was a shadow of its former self, racked by civil wars, barbarian invasions, and economic collapse. Something had to be done, and Diocletian believed he had found the answer. His solution was revolutionary: the tetrarchy, a system of 4 co-emperors who would share the burden of governing the vast Roman Empire. 2 senior emperors, called Augusti, would rule the eastern and western halves of the empire. Each Augustus would be assisted by a junior emperor, called a Caesar, who would serve as his heir and deputy. When an Augustus died or retired, his Caesar would take his place, and a new Caesar would be appointed. On the surface, it was brilliant. The empire would have 4 capable rulers instead of 1 overworked emperor. Each could focus on his own region, responding quickly to local crises without having to coordinate with distant colleagues. The succession problem that had plagued Rome for centuries would be solved through a clear, orderly process of promotion. Diocletian implemented his system with characteristic efficiency. He took the eastern half of the empire for himself, with his capital at Nicomedia in Asia Minor. His co-Augustus, Maximian, ruled the western half from Milan. The 2 Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, governed the Danube and Gallic regions respectively. The results were immediate and impressive. The tetrarchy brought stability to the empire for the first time in 50 years. The frontiers were secured against barbarian invasion. The economy was reformed and stabilized. The army was reorganized and re-equipped. Diocletian's administrative reforms created a more efficient bureaucracy that could actually govern the empire's vast territories. But there was a problem with Diocletian's solution. a flaw so fundamental that it would ultimately prove fatal. In dividing the empire to save it, he had destroyed the very thing that made Rome Roman, its unity. For over 1,000 years, Rome had been more than just a city or even an empire. It was an idea, a vision of universal civilization under a single law, a single authority, a single destiny. Romans from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, all shared in this common identity. They were all citizens of the same eternal city, subjects of the same divine emperor, participants in the same cosmic mission to bring order to the world. Diocletian's division shattered this unity. Suddenly, there were two Romes, two emperors, two centers of power. The eastern and western halves of the empire began to develop separate identities, separate interests, separate destinies. What had once been a single civilization began to split into two distinct cultures. The division was supposed to be administrative, not political. The empire was still theoretically one, ruled by colleagues who shared the same goals and values. But theory and practice are different things, and the practice of division inevitably led to the reality of separation. The eastern and western emperors began to compete with each other for resources, prestige, and legitimacy. Each wanted the best generals, the most loyal troops, the richest provinces. Each developed his own court, his own bureaucracy, his own vision of what the empire should become. The economic consequences were equally devastating. The Roman Empire had always been an integrated economic system, with goods, people, and ideas flowing freely across its vast territories. The division disrupted these flows, creating artificial barriers between regions that had been economically interdependent for centuries. Trade routes that had connected the eastern and western Mediterranean for generations were suddenly subject to different laws, different currencies, different administrative systems. Merchants who had once moved freely throughout the empire now faced bureaucratic obstacles and political uncertainties that made long-distance commerce increasingly difficult. The military implications were even worse. The Roman army had always been a unifying force, mixing soldiers from different provinces and creating a common military culture that transcended local loyalties. But the division of the empire led to the division of the army, with eastern and western forces developing separate traditions, separate loyalties, separate identities. Worse still, the eastern and western armies began to see each other as potential enemies rather than allies. When civil wars erupted, as they inevitably did, Roman soldiers found themselves fighting other Roman soldiers, weakening the empire as a whole while strengthening its barbarian enemies. The cultural impact was perhaps the most profound of all. Roman civilization had always been syncretic, absorbing and transforming influences from across the known world. Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, Germanic military traditions, Persian administrative techniques, all had been woven into the rich tapestry of Roman culture. But the division of the empire disrupted this cultural synthesis. The eastern half, centered on Constantinople, became increasingly Greek in character, while the western half remained more traditionally Latin. What had once been a single, diverse civilization began to fragment into separate cultural spheres. The religious consequences were equally significant. Christianity was spreading rapidly throughout the empire, but the division meant that Eastern and Western Christianity began to develop along different lines. Different theological traditions, different liturgical practices, different relationships with imperial authority, all would eventually contribute to the Great Schism between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. But perhaps the most fatal consequence of Diocletian's division was psychological. For the first time in Roman history, Romans began to think of themselves as Easterners or Westerners, rather than simply as Romans. The universal identity that had held the empire together for centuries began to fracture along regional lines. This psychological division made it easier for later emperors to abandon parts of the empire when they came under pressure. If you thought of yourself primarily as a Western Roman rather than simply as a Roman, it became possible to imagine abandoning the eastern provinces to save the West, or vice versa. The division also made it easier for barbarian peoples to play the eastern and western empires against each other. Clever barbarian leaders learned to seek alliance with one half of the empire against the other, turning Roman strength into Roman weakness. Diocletian himself seems to have understood some of these dangers. In 305, he took the unprecedented step of voluntarily retiring from power, hoping that his example would establish a tradition of peaceful succession, but his retirement only accelerated the empire's fragmentation, as his successors fought a series of civil wars that lasted for nearly 20 years. When Constantine finally reunited the empire in 324, the damage had already been done. The habit of division had been established, the precedent had been set. The idea that the empire could be split when circumstances required it had taken root in Roman thinking. Constantine tried to restore unity by founding a new capital, Constantinople, that would serve as a new Rome for the eastern provinces. But this only institutionalized the division he was trying to heal. Now there were two Romes, two centers of power, two focuses of imperial loyalty. The final division came in 395, when Emperor Theodosius died and left the eastern half of the empire to one son and the western half to another. This division was supposed to be temporary, but it became permanent. Never again would the Roman Empire be truly united under a single ruler. From that point forward, the history of Rome becomes the history of two separate empires, each following its own path, each facing its own challenges, each developing its own solutions. The Eastern Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, would survive for another 1,000 years. But the Western Empire, the Rome of Caesar and Augustus, of Cicero and Virgil, would fall within a century. The irony is profound. Diocletian's division was intended to save the Roman Empire, and in a sense, it succeeded. The eastern half of the empire did survive, preserving Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman culture well into the medieval period. But it survived by ceasing to be Roman in any meaningful sense, becoming instead a Greek empire that happened to call itself Roman. The Western Empire, meanwhile, was doomed by the very division that was supposed to save it. Cut off from the wealth and resources of the East, weakened by constant civil wars, unable to maintain its vast frontiers with diminished resources, it gradually collapsed under the weight of barbarian invasion and internal decay. Diocletian's fatal mistake wasn't malicious or stupid. It was the product of clear thinking, careful analysis, and genuine concern for the empire's welfare. But it was still a mistake, and a fatal one, because it destroyed the unity that was Rome's greatest strength. In trying to make the empire more governable, Diocletian made it less Roman. In trying to solve the immediate crisis of imperial administration, he created the conditions for the empire's ultimate destruction. In trying to save Rome, he killed it. The lesson is sobering. Sometimes the cure really is worse than the disease. Sometimes the very rationality of a solution is what makes it dangerous. And sometimes, in our eagerness to solve immediate problems, we create much larger problems for the future. Diocletian couldn't have known what his decision would lead to. He was dealing with an immediate crisis that threatened the empire's survival. His solution worked, at least in the short term. But the long-term consequences were catastrophic, and they remind us that even the best intentions can have the worst results. The Roman Empire didn't fall because of barbarian invasions or economic collapse or military defeat. It fell because it stopped being Roman, and it stopped being Roman because of a decision made with the best of intentions by one of its most capable emperors. That's the real tragedy of Rome's fall. It wasn't inevitable, it wasn't the result of external forces beyond Roman control, and it wasn't the product of decadence or moral decay. It was the result of a single fatal mistake made by a man who was trying to save the empire he loved. The Roman legions had once been the terror of the world. Disciplined, professional, and utterly loyal to Rome, they had conquered an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. But by the 4th century, something fundamental had changed. The army that had once embodied Roman virtue had become Rome's greatest liability. The transformation began with necessity. As we've seen, the empire's vast frontiers required more soldiers than Rome could provide from its own population. The solution seemed obvious. Recruit barbarians. Germanic tribes, Sarmatian cavalry, Gothic warriors, all were welcomed into Roman service as foederati. federated allies who fought under Roman standards in exchange for pay, land, and the promise of Roman citizenship. At first, this system worked well. Barbarian soldiers were often excellent fighters, and their different fighting styles and tactics added flexibility to Roman military operations. The empire had always been pragmatic about incorporating useful elements from conquered peoples, and barbarian military service seemed like just another example of Roman adaptability. But there was a crucial difference between earlier forms of Romanization and the militarization of barbarian peoples. When Rome conquered a territory, it gradually transformed the local population into Romans through law, culture, education, and civic participation. The process took generations, but it was thorough. By the end of it, the descendants of conquered peoples thought of themselves as Romans first and foremost. The barbarian foederati, however, were never truly Romanized. They served in the Roman army, but they maintained their own tribal identities, their own customs, their own loyalties. They were Romans in name only, mercenaries who happened to fight under Roman banners. This created a fundamental problem, an army that was Roman in organization, but barbarian in spirit. These soldiers had no deep emotional connection to Roman civilization, no inherited loyalty to the Roman state, no cultural investment in Roman success. They fought for Rome because Rome paid them, but their ultimate loyalty remained with their own people. The problem was compounded by the empire's division. Eastern and Western armies began to develop separate identities, separate traditions, separate loyalties. A Gothic warrior serving in the Western army had more in common with his tribal cousins fighting for the Eastern Empire than he did with the Roman civilians he was supposed to protect. The old Roman military culture, with its emphasis on discipline, sacrifice, and loyalty to the state, began to erode. Barbarian soldiers brought their own military traditions, their own concepts of honor, their own ideas about the relationship between warriors and the societies they served. In Germanic culture, warriors owed loyalty to their war chief, not to an abstract state. They fought for personal honor, for the glory of their tribe, for the chance to win wealth and status through combat. The Roman ideals of civic duty and collective sacrifice were foreign to them. This cultural transformation had practical consequences. Roman armies had always been disciplined, organized, and predictable. They followed orders, maintained formation, and executed complex tactical maneuvers with precision. But barbarian warriors were individualistic, impulsive, and difficult to control. They excelled in personal combat but struggled with the coordinated operations that had made Roman armies invincible. The change was gradual but inexorable. Each generation of barbarian recruits was less Roman than the last. Each new wave of foederati brought more of their own culture and less of Roman tradition. The army that had once been the school of Roman citizenship became a collection of tribal war bands held together by pay and plunder. The officer corps was equally transformed. In the early empire, military command had been the preserve of Roman aristocrats who saw military service as a civic duty and a path to political advancement. But as the empire became more militarized and less civilian in character, professional soldiers began to dominate the officer ranks. Many of these professional officers were themselves of barbarian origin. Men like Stilicho, the Vandal general who effectively ruled the Western Empire in the early 5th century, or Ricimer, the Suevian kingmaker who controlled a succession of puppet emperors. These men were competent soldiers and capable administrators, but they were not Romans in any meaningful sense. The result was an army that was increasingly alienated from the society it was supposed to defend. Roman civilians and barbarian soldiers lived in different worlds, spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and held different values. The army became a state within the state, a parallel society that happened to be based on Roman territory. This alienation had catastrophic consequences when the empire came under serious pressure. In 406, a massive barbarian invasion crossed the frozen Rhine and poured into Gaul. The Roman response was telling. Instead of uniting against the common threat, different barbarian groups within the Roman army began to calculate their own interests. Some remained loyal to Rome, at least temporarily. Others defected to the invaders. Still others tried to carve out independent kingdoms for themselves. The Roman army, which should have been the empire's shield against barbarian invasion, became part of the invasion itself. The sack of Rome by Alaric's Visigoths in 410 was particularly symbolic. Alaric had served in the Roman army for years. He knew Roman tactics, Roman weaknesses, Roman politics. When he turned against Rome, he did so not as a foreign invader, but as a former Roman general who had decided that his own interests lay elsewhere. The pattern repeated itself throughout the 5th century. Vandal, Ostrogothic, and Frankish leaders who had served Rome turned against it when circumstances changed. They used their knowledge of Roman military organization to create their own kingdoms on Roman territory, often employing other barbarian foederati who had learned their trade in Roman service. The Western Empire's final collapse was essentially a military coup carried out by its own army. In 476, Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain serving as a Roman general, deposed the last Western emperor and declared himself king of Italy. He didn't conquer the Roman Empire. He simply took it over from within. The Eastern Empire survived longer, partly because it managed to maintain more control over its barbarian recruits. Eastern emperors were more successful at playing different barbarian groups against each other, preventing any single group from becoming too powerful. They also maintained stronger civilian institutions that could balance military power. But even in the East, the army's barbarization created long-term problems. The empire became increasingly dependent on foreign mercenaries who had no loyalty to Roman civilization. When these mercenaries were no longer needed or could no longer be paid, they often turned to raiding and conquest. The transformation of the Roman army from a force of Roman citizens to a collection of barbarian mercenaries was perhaps the most visible symbol of the empire's decline. An institution that had once embodied Roman values and served Roman interests became a vehicle for the empire's destruction. The irony is that this transformation was driven by military necessity. The empire needed soldiers, and barbarians were available, willing, and often effective. But in solving the immediate problem of military recruitment, Rome created a much larger problem, an army that was no longer Roman in any meaningful sense. The lesson is clear. Institutions are more than just organizational structures. They are carriers of culture, values, and identity. When you change the people who staff an institution, you inevitably change the institution itself. And when you change a crucial institution like the army, you change the entire character of the society it serves. Rome's army forgot Rome because Rome forgot what it meant to be Roman. The empire's citizens were no longer willing to serve in the military, so the empire hired foreigners to do the job. But foreigners, no matter how capable, could never be the guardians of Roman civilization in the way that Roman citizens had been. The result was an army that was technically Roman but spiritually barbarian, an army that served Rome's immediate needs but undermined Rome's long-term survival. It was another consequence of Diocletian's fatal mistake. The division of the empire had made it impossible to maintain the unified Roman identity that had once motivated citizens to serve their state. In the end, Rome fell not to foreign conquest, but to internal transformation. The barbarians didn't destroy the Roman army. They became the Roman army. And once that happened, the distinction between Roman and barbarian became meaningless. The empire survived in name, but Rome itself was already dead. For centuries, the word barbarian had been synonymous with chaos, savagery, and everything that Rome was not. Romans used it to describe anyone who lived beyond the civilized boundaries of the empire, anyone who didn't speak Latin or Greek, anyone who hadn't been touched by the transforming power of Roman law and culture. But by the 4th century, this comfortable distinction was breaking down. The barbarians were no longer safely beyond the gates. They were inside the empire, serving in its armies, governing its provinces, and increasingly making its decisions. The transformation of these peoples from enemies to allies to masters is one of the most dramatic reversals in human history. The change didn't happen overnight. For generations, barbarian tribes had been pressing against Rome's frontiers, not out of any grand plan to destroy the empire, but simply because they were being pushed westward by even more dangerous enemies. The Huns, a nomadic people from the Asian steppes, had begun a great migration that would reshape the entire European continent. The Huns were unlike any enemy Rome had faced before. They were superb horsemen and archers, capable of appearing suddenly out of nowhere, devastating a region, and disappearing before Roman forces could respond. They didn't want to conquer Roman territory in the traditional sense. They wanted to control the peoples who lived on it, extracting tribute and recruits for their own armies. The pressure of Hunnic expansion forced Germanic tribes to seek refuge within Roman borders. These weren't the primitive savages of Roman propaganda. Many had been in contact with Roman civilization for centuries. They had learned Roman military techniques, adopted Roman weapons and tactics, and developed sophisticated political organizations. The Visigoths, for example, had been Romanized to a considerable degree before they crossed the Danube in 376. They had served as Roman allies, traded with Roman merchants, and absorbed Roman cultural influences. When they requested permission to settle within the empire, they weren't asking to destroy Roman civilization. They were asking to join it. The Roman response to this request revealed how far the empire had fallen from its earlier ideals. Instead of welcoming the Visigoths as potential citizens and gradually integrating them into Roman society, imperial officials treated them as a problem to be managed. They were settled in marginal lands, poorly supplied, and subjected to systematic exploitation by corrupt administrators. The result was predictable. The Visigoths rebelled. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378, they destroyed a Roman army and killed Emperor Valens. It was one of the worst military disasters in Roman history, and it marked the beginning of the end for Roman control of the Balkans. But even this catastrophe didn't teach Rome the right lessons. Instead of addressing the underlying problems that had caused the rebellion, the empire continued to treat barbarian peoples as temporary nuisances rather than permanent realities. The policy remained one of containment and exploitation rather than integration and assimilation. This short-sighted approach had catastrophic consequences. Barbarian groups that might have become loyal Roman allies instead became implacable enemies. Peoples who had initially sought Roman protection learned that they could only find security through their own strength. The situation was made worse by the empire's division. Eastern and Western emperors often pursued contradictory policies toward barbarian peoples, each trying to deflect threats toward the other half of the empire. Barbarian leaders learned to play East against West, extracting concessions from both sides while committing to neither. The Visigoths under Alaric were masters of this game. They served the Eastern Empire against the West, then switched sides when it suited their interests. They demanded tribute, land, and official recognition as Roman allies, but they maintained their independence and their ability to threaten Roman cities when their demands weren't met. Alaric's sack of Rome in 410 was the culmination of this process. It wasn't a barbarian conquest in the traditional sense, it was a labor dispute that got out of hand. Alaric had served Rome faithfully for years, but when the empire failed to honor its agreements with him, he decided to collect his payment by force. The psychological impact of Rome's sack was enormous. For 800 years, no foreign enemy had entered the Eternal City. Romans had believed that their capital was protected by the gods themselves. When Alaric's Visigoths marched through the streets of Rome, looting palaces and churches, that belief was shattered forever. But the sack of Rome was just the beginning. In 455, the Vandals sacked the city again. In 472, Ricimer's Germanic troops occupied it. By the end of the 5th century, Rome had been sacked so many times that it had lost its symbolic power. The Eternal City had become just another prize to be fought over by barbarian warlords. The pattern was repeated throughout the Western Empire. In Gaul, the Franks established a kingdom that would eventually become France. In Spain, the Visigoths created a realm that lasted for 3 centuries. In North Africa, the Vandals built a maritime empire that controlled the Western Mediterranean. These weren't temporary occupations. They were permanent transformations. The barbarian kingdoms that emerged from the ruins of the Western Empire weren't trying to restore Roman rule. They were creating something new, something that combined barbarian political traditions with Roman administrative techniques. The process was often surprisingly peaceful. Many Roman aristocrats found that they could maintain their wealth and status by collaborating with barbarian rulers. Many barbarian leaders found that they could govern more effectively by adopting Roman administrative practices. The result was a gradual fusion of Roman and barbarian elements that created the foundations of medieval European civilization. But this fusion came at a cost: the end of Roman unity. What had once been a single empire became a patchwork of competing kingdoms, each with its own laws, customs, and interests. The universal civilization that Rome had created was replaced by a collection of local cultures that happened to share some common Roman heritage. The Eastern Empire survived this transformation, but only by becoming something different. The Byzantine Empire that emerged from the eastern provinces was Greek rather than Latin, Orthodox rather than Catholic, autocratic rather than republican. It preserved many Roman institutions, but it was no longer Roman in any meaningful sense. The barbarian invasions weren't the cause of Rome's fall. They were the consequence of Rome's internal weaknesses. The empire fell because it had lost the ability to assimilate new peoples, to inspire loyalty among its subjects, to maintain the unity that had been its greatest strength. The barbarians didn't destroy Roman civilization, they inherited it. But they inherited it in fragments, and they lacked the vision or the power to put those fragments back together. The result was the end of the ancient world and the beginning of the medieval period, a time when Europe would be divided among competing kingdoms rather than united under a single empire. The irony is that many of the barbarian leaders who conquered Roman territory genuinely admired Roman civilization. They wanted to be Romans, or at least to rule Romans. But the empire's division and internal conflicts made it impossible for them to achieve this goal through peaceful means. If Rome had remained united, if it had maintained the assimilative power that had once been its greatest strength, the barbarian invasions might have been just another chapter in the long story of Roman expansion. Instead, they became the final chapter in the story of Roman decline. The barbarians at the gates weren't Rome's enemies. They were Rome's abandoned children, peoples who had been touched by Roman civilization but never fully embraced by it. When they finally broke through the gates, they weren't destroying Rome. They were claiming their inheritance. But by then, there was no longer a Rome to inherit, only the fragments of what had once been the greatest empire in human history. The year was 410 of the Common Era. For over 8 centuries, Rome had stood inviolate, protected by its armies, its walls, and the belief that the gods themselves watched over the eternal city. No foreign enemy had breached its defenses since the Gauls under Brennus had sacked it in 390 before the Common Era. Rome wasn't just a city, it was a symbol, an idea, the beating heart of civilization itself. But on August 24th, 410, that symbol was shattered forever. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, led his warriors through the gates of Rome and subjected the Eternal City to 3 days of systematic looting. The psychological shock was devastating, not just for Romans, but for the entire civilized world. To understand the full impact of this catastrophe, we need to appreciate what Rome meant to the people of the 4th and 5th centuries. This wasn't just the capital of an empire. It was the center of the universe, the place where heaven and earth met, the city that the gods had chosen to rule the world. Rome's very architecture proclaimed its eternal destiny, the Forum Romanum, where senators had debated the fate of nations for centuries, the Circus Maximus, where 250,000 spectators could watch chariot races, the Colosseum, where gladiators had died for the entertainment of the masses, the Pantheon, where all the gods of the empire were worshipped together. These weren't just buildings. They were monuments to Roman permanence, physical proof that Rome would endure forever. The city's population of nearly 1 million people made it the largest urban center in the Western world. Its wealth, accumulated through centuries of conquest and tribute, was legendary. But by 410, Rome's glory was largely a memory. The emperors had long since moved their capitals to more strategic locations: Milan, Ravenna, Constantinople. The city's population had declined dramatically as economic opportunities shifted elsewhere. Many of the great monuments were falling into disrepair. Still, Rome retained its symbolic power. It was still the eternal city, still the heart of the empire, still the place where the gods dwelt among men. The idea that barbarians could actually enter Rome, could loot its treasures and humiliate its people, was literally unthinkable. Alaric's path to Rome had been long and complex. He was a Visigoth, one of the Germanic peoples who had been pushed westward by Hunnic pressure. but he was also a Roman, in the sense that he had served in the Roman army and held Roman military rank. He understood Roman politics, Roman weaknesses, and Roman fears. For years, Alaric had played a dangerous game, serving sometimes as a Roman ally, sometimes as a Roman enemy, always pursuing his own people's interests. He had demanded land for his followers, official recognition of his authority, and regular payments from the Roman treasury. When these demands were met, he was a loyal federatus. When they were ignored, he became a dangerous enemy. The immediate cause of Alaric's march on Rome was a dispute over payment. The Western Empire, struggling with financial crisis and political instability, had failed to honor its agreements with the Visigothic king. Alaric had tried negotiation, diplomacy, and threats. When all else failed, he decided to collect his payment by force. The siege of Rome was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Alaric didn't assault the city's walls, he simply surrounded it and waited. Rome's massive population required enormous quantities of food, most of which came from North Africa and Sicily. When Alaric cut off these supply lines, the city began to starve. The Roman Senate, that ancient institution that had once governed the Mediterranean world, was reduced to negotiating with a barbarian king for the survival of their city. They offered tribute, hostages, even the promise of future cooperation. But Alaric's demands kept escalating. The final negotiations were conducted by Pope Innocent I, a sign of how much the Christian Church had replaced traditional Roman institutions as the real power in the city. But even papal intervention couldn't prevent the catastrophe that was coming. On August 24th, the gates of Rome were opened. Some sources suggest treachery by slaves or Gothic sympathizers within the city. Others point to the simple fact that Rome's defenders were outnumbered and demoralized. The exact mechanism doesn't matter. What matters is that the unthinkable had happened. Alaric's Visigoths poured into the eternal city like a flood. But this wasn't the mindless destruction that Roman propaganda had always associated with barbarian invasions. Alaric was a Christian, and he had given strict orders that churches were to be respected and civilians were not to be harmed unnecessarily. The sack was systematic and disciplined. The Visigoths targeted the palaces of the wealthy, the temples of the old gods, and the public buildings that contained the accumulated treasures of centuries. They loaded wagons with gold, silver, precious stones, and works of art. They took hostages from prominent families, including Galla Placidia, the emperor's sister. But they didn't burn the city or massacre its population. This was a business transaction, not an act of genocide. Alaric wanted to demonstrate his power and collect what he was owed, not to destroy Roman civilization entirely. The 3 days of looting were carefully controlled. When they were over, Alaric led his people out of Rome, taking their plunder and their hostages with them. The city was left intact, but humiliated, stripped of its treasures, but not of its life. The immediate physical damage was relatively limited. Rome would recover from the material losses within a generation, but the psychological damage was irreparable. The myth of Roman invincibility had been shattered. The eternal city had been shown to be as vulnerable as any other. The news of Rome's sack spread throughout the empire like wildfire. In distant provinces, Roman citizens wept openly. In barbarian lands, warriors sharpened their swords and began to dream of their own marches on Roman cities. The balance of power in the Mediterranean world had shifted permanently. Saint Jerome, writing from his monastery in Bethlehem, captured the mood of the times. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. St. Augustine began writing his masterpiece, The City of God, partly as a response to pagans who blamed Christianity for Rome's fall. But perhaps the most telling response came from the Emperor Honorius, who was safely ensconced in his capital at Ravenna. When told that Rome had fallen, he reportedly panicked, thinking that his favorite rooster, also named Rome, had died. When assured that the bird was safe, he relaxed. The anecdote may be apocryphal, but it perfectly captures the disconnect between the imperial government and the reality of the empire's situation. Alaric himself didn't live long to enjoy his triumph. He died later that same year, possibly of fever, while planning an invasion of North Africa. His followers buried him in a riverbed, along with much of the treasure he had taken from Rome, then diverted the river back to its original course to hide the grave forever. But Alaric's death didn't undo the damage he had inflicted. Rome had been sacked, and the world had seen it happen. The precedent had been set. Other barbarian leaders would follow Alaric's example, and Rome would be sacked again and again in the decades that followed. The sack of 410 was not the end of Rome, but it was the beginning of the end. It marked the moment when the eternal city's eternal nature was revealed to be a myth. Rome was not protected by the gods. It was not destined to rule forever. It was just another city, vulnerable to the same forces that had destroyed countless other cities throughout history. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. For over a millennium, Romans had believed in their own destiny, their own permanence, their own divine mission to rule the world. When that belief was shattered, something essential died in the Roman spirit. The empire would limp on for another 66 years in the west, another 1,000 years in the east, but it would never again be the confident, expansive, world-conquering force that it had once been. The sack of Rome marked the end of the ancient world and the beginning of something new, something smaller, something more fragmented. In trying to save the empire through division, Diocletian had made it vulnerable to exactly this kind of catastrophe. A united Rome might have been able to prevent Alaric's march on the capital, or at least to respond more effectively to the crisis. But a divided empire, with its resources scattered and its attention divided, could not protect even its most sacred symbols. The eternal city had fallen, and with it, the dream of eternal Rome. What remained was just another collection of medieval kingdoms, squabbling over the fragments of what had once been the greatest empire in human history. His name was Romulus Augustulus, and he was perhaps the most ironically named ruler in human history. Romulus, after the legendary founder of Rome. Augustulus, Little Augustus, after the first and greatest of the Roman emperors. But this Romulus would not found an empire. He would witness its end. And this Augustus would not bring glory to Rome. He would preside over its final humiliation. The year was 476 of the Common Era. The Western Roman Empire, that mighty colossus that had once bestrode the Mediterranean world, had been reduced to a rump state centered on Italy. Its provinces had been carved up among barbarian kingdoms. Its armies consisted largely of Germanic mercenaries. Its treasury was empty, its authority was a joke, and its very existence depended on the whims of barbarian warlords. Romulus Augustulus was not even a real emperor in any meaningful sense. He was a child, probably no more than 12 years old, placed on the throne by his father Orestes, a former secretary to Attila the Hun who had seized power through a military coup. The boy emperor was a puppet, a figurehead, a symbol of how far the mighty had fallen. But even puppet emperors need someone to pull their strings, and Orestes found himself facing an impossible situation. His Germanic troops, led by a chieftain named Odoacer, were demanding what barbarian soldiers had always demanded: land, money, and recognition. Specifically, they wanted 1/3 of the land in Italy to be distributed among them as permanent settlements. Orestes refused. Perhaps he still believed in the fiction of Roman sovereignty. Perhaps he thought he could find another solution. Perhaps he simply couldn't bring himself to formally acknowledge that Italy itself had become barbarian territory. Whatever his reasons, his refusal sealed his fate and that of his son. Odoacer was not a wild barbarian chieftain in the Roman imagination. He was a sophisticated political operator who understood both Germanic warrior culture and Roman administrative systems. He had served in the Roman army, held Roman military rank, and learned Roman political techniques. When he decided to act against Orestes, he did so with careful calculation. The rebellion was swift and decisive. Orestes was captured and executed. His supporters were scattered or killed. Within weeks, Odoacer controlled Italy and held the fate of the last Western emperor in his hands. But what to do with Romulus Augustulus? The boy had committed no crimes except being born into an impossible situation. He posed no real threat to anyone. He was in many ways as much a victim of circumstances as anyone else. Odoacer's solution was elegant and historically significant. He didn't execute the boy emperor, as might have been expected. Instead, he formally deposed him, granted him a generous pension, and sent him into comfortable retirement. The message was clear. The Western Roman Empire was over, but it was ending not with violence but with a kind of bureaucratic efficiency. More importantly, Odoacer didn't claim the imperial title for himself. He understood that calling himself emperor would invite challenges from the Eastern Empire, from other barbarian leaders, and from Romans who still believed in the legitimacy of imperial rule. Instead, he took the title of King of Italy and formally returned the imperial regalia to Constantinople. This was a masterstroke of political theater. By returning the imperial symbols to the Eastern Emperor, Odoacer was acknowledging that there was still a Roman Empire, just not in the West. He was positioning himself not as a usurper, but as a legitimate ruler who happened to govern former Roman territory on behalf of the true emperor in Constantinople. The Eastern Emperor Zeno found himself in an awkward position. He couldn't realistically challenge Odoacer's control of Italy, but he also couldn't formally recognize the end of the Western Empire. His solution was to grant Odoacer the title of patrician and to acknowledge him as the legitimate ruler of Italy, while maintaining the fiction that this was a temporary arrangement. And so, with remarkably little fanfare, the Western Roman Empire came to an end. There were no great battles, no dramatic last stands, no heroic speeches about Roman virtue and destiny. The last emperor was simply pensioned off, and life went on. The date traditionally given for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is September 4th, 476, when Romulus Augustulus was deposed. But this date is somewhat arbitrary. The empire had been effectively dead for decades before Odoacer made it official. The real question is not when Rome fell, but why it fell so quietly, with so little resistance, with so little sense that anything truly important was ending. The answer lies in the transformation that had been taking place for over a century. By 476, there were very few people left who thought of themselves as Romans in the old sense. The army was barbarian. The administration was largely barbarian. Even many of the so-called Roman aristocrats were of barbarian descent. More importantly, the institutions that had once made Rome Roman had long since disappeared or been transformed beyond recognition. The Senate still existed, but it was a shadow of its former self. The consulship still existed, but it was an empty honor. The citizenship that had once been the pride of the empire had been extended to everyone and therefore meant nothing. The division of the empire had accelerated this process of de-Romanization. When there were two emperors, two capitals, two administrations, the idea of a single Roman identity became increasingly meaningless. People began to think of themselves as Easterners or Westerners, as subjects of this emperor or that emperor, rather than as Romans. The barbarian kingdoms that had emerged in the former Western provinces offered an alternative model of governance that was often more effective than the decaying imperial system. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain, the Frankish kingdom in Gaul, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, all provided security, justice, and prosperity to their subjects without the crushing taxation and bureaucratic inefficiency that had characterized the late empire. By 476, many people in the former Western provinces were probably better off under barbarian rule than they had been under Roman rule. The barbarian kings were often more accessible than distant emperors, more responsive to local needs, more willing to adapt their policies to local conditions. The end of the Western Empire was not a catastrophe for most of its former subjects. It was simply a change of management, a recognition of what had already become reality. The Roman Empire in the West had been dead for decades. Odoacer simply buried the corpse. But what about Romulus Augustulus himself? What happened to the last emperor of the West? The historical record is frustratingly vague. We know that Odoacer granted him a pension of 6,000 gold pieces per year and allowed him to retire to a villa in Campania. After that, he disappears from history. Some sources suggest that he lived quietly as a private citizen, perhaps becoming a monk in his later years. Others hint that he may have been involved in later attempts to restore imperial rule in Italy. But the truth is that we simply don't know. The last emperor of the West vanished into obscurity, which is perhaps fitting for a man who had been emperor in name only. The irony of Romulus Augustulus is profound. He bore the names of Rome's founder and its greatest emperor, but he presided over Rome's end. He was called Augustus, but he had no real power. He was supposed to be the heir to Caesar and Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, but he was just a child caught up in events far beyond his control or understanding. In many ways, Romulus Augustulus was the perfect symbol of what the Western Empire had become: a hollow shell, a meaningless title, a reminder of past greatness that no longer had any connection to present reality. His deposition was not the cause of Rome's fall, but merely the formal acknowledgement of what had already happened. The Eastern Empire would continue to call itself Roman for another 1,000 years, but the Rome of Caesar and Augustus, of Cicero and Virgil, of the legions and the eagles and the dream of universal empire, died with Romulus Augustulus. What survived was something different, something that preserved some Roman forms and traditions, but had lost the Roman spirit. The last emperor of the West was not a hero or a villain. He was simply the final actor in a tragedy that had been unfolding for over a century. His story reminds us that history is not always made by great men making great decisions. Sometimes it is made by ordinary people, caught up in forces beyond their control, doing their best to survive in a world that no longer makes sense. Romulus Augustulus was the last emperor, but he was not the last Roman. That distinction belongs to all of us who still remember what Rome was supposed to represent: the idea that human beings can create order out of chaos, justice out of conflict, civilization out of barbarism. As long as that idea survives, something of Rome survives with it. But the empire itself, the political and military structure that had dominated the Mediterranean world for over 5 centuries, was gone forever. And its end can be traced back to a single decision made with the best of intentions by a man who thought he was saving Rome when he was actually destroying it. The Western Roman Empire officially ended in 476, but its fall was not a single event. It was a process, a slow-motion collapse that had been unfolding for over 2 centuries. And in many ways, that collapse is still continuing today, as we struggle with the same fundamental questions that destroyed Rome. How do you maintain unity in diversity? How do you balance central authority with local autonomy? How do you preserve civilization in the face of internal decay and external pressure? The immediate aftermath of Rome's fall was not the dark age that many people imagine. Life went on. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman rule often provided better governance than the empire had in its final decades. Trade continued, cities survived, and Roman law and culture persisted in modified forms. But something essential had been lost: the idea of universal civilization under a single authority. The Mediterranean world, which had been unified under Roman rule for over 5 centuries, fragmented into competing kingdoms, each with its own laws, customs, and interests. The dream of a single human community governed by reason and justice was replaced by the reality of tribal loyalties and local power. The Eastern Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, survived for another 1,000 years, but it survived by abandoning most of what had made Rome Roman. It became Greek rather than Latin, Orthodox rather than Catholic, autocratic rather than republican. It preserved Roman law and Roman administrative techniques, but it lost the Roman spirit of expansion, assimilation, and universal citizenship. The Byzantine Empire was a remarkable achievement in its own right, but it was not Rome in any meaningful sense. It was a Greek empire that happened to call itself Roman, a medieval state that preserved some ancient forms while abandoning ancient ideals. In the West, the barbarian kingdoms that emerged from the ruins of the empire gradually developed into the medieval European states that we know from history. The Frankish kingdom became France. The Visigothic kingdom became Spain. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms became England. Each preserved some Roman elements while developing its own distinct character. But none of these successor states could match the scope and ambition of the Roman Empire at its height. They were regional powers, not universal empires. They governed territories, not civilizations. They ruled subjects, not citizens. The Holy Roman Empire, founded by Charlemagne in 800, was an attempt to restore Roman universalism. but it was Roman in name only, a loose confederation of German principalities that never achieved the unity or effectiveness of the original empire. It lasted for over 1,000 years, but it was always more of an aspiration than a reality. The real heir to Roman civilization was not any political entity, but the Catholic Church. The Church preserved Roman law, Roman administrative techniques, and Roman Universalist ideals. It maintained a single authority governing diverse peoples across vast territories. It promoted a common culture and a common set of values. In many ways, the medieval church was more Roman than any of the political states that claimed Roman heritage. But the church's universalism was spiritual rather than political. It could unite souls, but not territories. It could provide moral guidance, but not effective governance. The medieval world remained politically fragmented, a collection of competing kingdoms rather than a unified empire. The Renaissance brought a renewed interest in Roman civilization, but it was an antiquarian interest rather than a practical one. Renaissance humanists studied Roman literature, art, and philosophy, but they made no serious attempt to restore Roman political institutions. The nation-states that emerged from the medieval period were based on ethnic and linguistic unity rather than Roman universalism. The modern world has seen several attempts to recreate something like the Roman Empire: Napoleon's Empire, Hitler's Third Reich, the Soviet Union, the European Union. All have been compared to Rome, and all have failed to achieve Rome's combination of unity, stability, and longevity. The United States, with its republican institutions, its federal structure, and its universalist ideals, is perhaps the closest modern equivalent to the Roman Republic. But America faces many of the same challenges that destroyed Rome: the tension between central authority and local autonomy, the difficulty of maintaining civic virtue in a wealthy society, the challenge of assimilating diverse populations into a common culture. The parallels are striking and sobering. Like Rome, America has grown from a small republic into a global empire. Like Rome, it faces pressure from barbarian peoples who want to share in its prosperity. Like Rome, it struggles with the corruption that comes with wealth and power. Like Rome, it is tempted to solve its problems through division rather than unity. The lesson of Rome's fall is not that empires inevitably collapse, though they do, but that they collapse for specific, identifiable reasons. Rome fell because it abandoned the principles that had made it great. It fell because it chose short-term solutions over long-term stability. It fell because it lost faith in its own mission and values. Most importantly, Rome fell because it divided itself. Diocletian's decision to split the empire was rational, practical, and necessary given the circumstances of his time. But it was also fatal, because it destroyed the unity that was Rome's greatest strength. The division of the empire created two competing centers of power, where there had been one. It encouraged regional loyalties at the expense of imperial loyalty. It made it easier for barbarian peoples to play east against west. It transformed a single civilization into two separate cultures. The process was gradual and initially successful. The Tetrarchy brought stability to the empire for the first time in generations. The division allowed each half of the empire to focus on its own problems without being distracted by distant crises. For a while, it seemed like Diocletian had found the perfect solution to the problem of imperial governance. But the long-term consequences were catastrophic. The division institutionalized the empire's fragmentation. It made permanent what was supposed to be temporary. It created the precedent for further divisions, further fragmentations, further weakening of imperial authority. By the 5th century, the Western Empire was so weak that it could not defend itself against barbarian invasion. By the 6th century, it had ceased to exist as a political entity. The Eastern Empire survived longer, but only by becoming something entirely different from what Rome had originally been. The tragedy of Rome's fall is that it was preventable. The empire did not fall because of external enemies or natural disasters or inevitable historical forces. It fell because of human decisions, human mistakes, human failures of imagination and will. If Diocletian had found a way to reform the empire without dividing it, if later emperors had maintained Roman unity while adapting to changed circumstances, If the Roman people had preserved their civic virtue and their commitment to the common good, the empire might have survived and evolved rather than collapsed and fragmented. But history does not offer second chances. The decisions were made, the consequences followed, and the Roman Empire fell. What remains is the memory of what was lost and the warning of what can happen when great civilizations abandon the principles that made them great. The fall of Rome is not just ancient history. It is a continuing story, a permanent reminder of the fragility of human achievement and the importance of the choices we make. Every generation faces the same fundamental questions that confronted Diocletian. How do we balance unity and diversity? How do we maintain central authority while respecting local autonomy? How do we preserve what is valuable from the past while adapting to the challenges of the present? The answers we give to these questions will determine whether our own civilization survives and thrives or follows Rome into the dustbin of history. The choice, as always, is ours. But the example of Rome reminds us that even the mightiest empires can fall, and that the greatest danger often comes not from external enemies, but from our own internal divisions and failures of vision. Rome fell because it stopped being Roman. It stopped believing in its own mission, its own values, its own destiny. It chose the easy path of division over the hard path of unity. It traded its birthright for a mess of pottage, and in the end, it lost both. The lesson is clear. Civilizations are not destroyed by their enemies. They are destroyed by their own choices. And the most fatal choice of all is the choice to abandon the unity that makes civilization possible in the first place. That was Rome's fatal mistake. It divided itself to save itself, and in doing so, it destroyed itself. The empire that had once seemed eternal proved to be as mortal as any other human creation. But its memory endures, a reminder of both the heights that human civilization can reach and the depths to which it can fall. The Roman Empire is gone, but the Roman question remains. Will we choose unity or division? Will we preserve what makes us great, or will we trade it away for temporary advantage? Will we learn from Rome's example, or will we repeat Rome's mistakes? The answer lies not in the past, but in the future, not in what Rome did, but in what we choose to do. The fall of Rome is not just history, it is prophecy, a warning of what awaits any civilization that forgets what made it great in the first place. And so the fall continues, not as a single event, but as an ongoing process, a permanent reminder that even the mightiest empires are only as strong as the unity that holds them together. Rome divided itself and fell. The question that haunts us still is whether we will be wise enough to learn from Rome's fatal mistake, or whether we too will choose division over unity and suffer the same inevitable fate. The eternal city is gone, but the eternal question remains. And on our answer hangs the fate not just of our own civilization, but of civilization itself. Tonight, we've journeyed through one of history's greatest tragedies, the fall of an empire that thought it couldn't die. We've seen how Rome rose from humble beginnings to rule the world, how it transformed from republic to empire, how it grew fat on its own success, and how it ultimately destroyed itself through a single fatal decision. Diocletian's division of the empire seemed like wisdom at the time. It was logical, practical, necessary, but it was also the beginning of the end, because it destroyed the very thing that made Rome Roman, its unity. The lesson echoes through the centuries. Sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. Sometimes our solutions become our problems. Sometimes, in trying to save what we love, we end up destroying it. Rome fell not because it was weak, but because it forgot what made it strong. Not because of its enemies, but because of its own choices. Not because it had to, but because it chose to. And that choice, the choice between unity and division, between strength and convenience, between the hard path and the easy path, is one that every civilization must make. Rome made the wrong choice. The question that haunts us still is, what choice will we make? Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of history. Until next time, remember, Empires rise and fall, but the lessons they leave behind are eternal. And the greatest lesson of all is this: unity is strength, division is death, and the choice between them is always ours to make. But before we close this chapter on Rome's tragic end, we must ask ourselves the most uncomfortable question of all. Are we making the same mistakes today? Look around you. Look at the world we've built, the civilization we've inherited, the unity we've taken for granted. Do you see the cracks? Do you hear the echoes of Rome's final centuries in our own time? We live in an age of unprecedented prosperity, just as Rome did in the 2nd century. We have technology that would seem like magic to ancient eyes, wealth that would make Caesar weep with envy, power that spans the globe. But we also have something else that Rome had in its final days, the dangerous illusion that our success makes us invincible. Like Rome, we face pressures at our borders, not barbarian tribes, but waves of migration, economic disruption, and cultural transformation that challenge our ability to maintain cohesion. Like Rome, we struggle with the question of how to integrate new peoples, new ideas, new ways of life into our existing framework. Like Rome, we are tempted by the easy solution of division. When problems become too complex, when unity becomes too difficult, when the center cannot hold, the natural human response is to break things into smaller, more manageable pieces. It's logical. It's practical. It's exactly what Diocletian thought when he divided the empire. But logic isn't always wisdom, and the most logical solution can sometimes be the most dangerous one. Consider our own divisions, not just political, but cultural, economic, generational. Consider how we've sorted ourselves into separate communities, separate media ecosystems, separate realities. Consider how we've allowed our differences to become more important than our commonalities, our tribal loyalties to override our shared humanity. This is how empires die, not with a bang, but with a whisper, not through conquest, but through fragmentation, not because they're destroyed from without, but because they destroy themselves from within. Rome's legions didn't disappear overnight. They gradually became less Roman and more barbarian, until the distinction became meaningless. Rome's citizens didn't suddenly stop being Roman. They slowly lost interest in being Roman, until citizenship became just another administrative category. Rome's unity didn't shatter in a single moment. It eroded slowly, imperceptibly, until one day people woke up and realized that the empire they thought they belonged to no longer existed. The process was so gradual that most Romans didn't even notice it happening. They went about their daily lives, paid their taxes, attended their entertainments, and assumed that Rome would always be there. They couldn't imagine a world without the empire, because the empire was all they had ever known. But empires, like all human creations, are more fragile than they appear. They depend not on stone and steel, but on something much more delicate, the shared belief that they should exist. When that belief dies, the empire dies with it, no matter how mighty its armies or how vast its territories. This is the real lesson of Rome's fall, the one that should keep us awake at night. Civilizations don't collapse because they have to. They collapse because they choose to. They collapse because the people who make them up stop believing in them, stop working for them, stop sacrificing for them. They collapse because unity becomes too hard and division seems too easy, because the common good becomes less important than individual advantage, because the long-term future becomes less compelling than short-term gain. They collapse because people forget that civilization is not a natural state but an artificial one, not a given but a gift, not a right but a responsibility. Rome forgot this. In its final centuries, Romans stopped thinking of themselves as Romans first and something else second. They became Christians or pagans, Easterners or Westerners, rich or poor, citizens or barbarians. They lost the overarching identity that had once made them the masters of the world. The question that haunts us is whether we're making the same mistake. Are we still Americans, or Europeans, or citizens of the world? Or have we become something smaller, something more tribal, something that puts our differences before our commonalities? Are we still committed to the ideals that built our civilization? Liberty, equality, justice, the rule of law, the dignity of the individual? Or have we decided that these ideals are too expensive, too difficult, too inconvenient for the modern world? Are we still willing to sacrifice for the common good, to work together despite our differences, to maintain the unity that makes civilization possible? Or have we chosen the easier path of division, fragmentation, and tribal loyalty? The choice is ours, just as it was Rome's. But we have an advantage that Rome didn't have. We know how the story ends. We've seen what happens when great civilizations choose division over unity, when they trade their birthright for temporary advantage, when they forget what made them great in the first place. We know that empires can fall. We know that civilizations can die. We know that even the mightiest human achievements can crumble into dust if the people who created them stop believing in them. But we also know something else. It doesn't have to happen. The fall is not inevitable. The choice is still ours to make. We can choose unity over division. We can choose the common good over individual advantage. We can choose to remember what makes us great instead of forgetting it in the pursuit of temporary gain. We can choose to learn from Rome's fatal mistake instead of repeating it, but only if we act now while there's still time. Only if we recognize the danger before it's too late. Only if we remember that civilizations are not destroyed by their enemies, but by their own choices. The barbarians are not at the gates. They're in our hearts, in our minds, in our willingness to choose the easy path over the right path, division over unity, tribal loyalty over common humanity. The empire is not falling to foreign invasion. It's falling to internal decay, to the slow erosion of the beliefs and values that once made us strong. The eternal city is not being sacked by barbarian armies. It's being abandoned by its own citizens, who have forgotten why it was worth defending in the first place. But it's not too late. It's never too late as long as there are people willing to remember, willing to choose, willing to sacrifice for something greater than themselves. Rome fell because Romans stopped being Roman. We don't have to make the same mistake. We can choose to remain who we are, to preserve what makes us great, to maintain the unity that makes civilization possible. The choice is ours. The time is now. The question is whether we have the wisdom to learn from history or the folly to repeat it. Rome's fall was not inevitable. Neither is ours. But only if we choose unity over division, strength over convenience, the hard path over the easy path. Only if we remember that empires rise and fall, but the choices that determine their fate are eternal. Only if we choose to be worthy of the civilization we've inherited, instead of the generation that let it die. The Roman Empire is gone, but the Roman question remains. What will we choose? The answer will determine not just our fate, but the fate of human civilization itself. And on that choice, as on all the great choices of history, hangs the destiny of the world. The fire crackles lower now, the shadows grow longer, and the weight of history settles around us like a shroud. We've walked with emperors and barbarians, witnessed the rise and fall of the greatest empire the world has ever known, and learned the hardest lesson of all, that even the mightiest human achievements are only as strong as the unity that holds them together. Rome thought it was eternal. Rome thought it couldn't fall. Rome thought its divisions would save it. Rome was wrong. The question that echoes through the centuries, that whispers in the wind through the ruins of the Forum, that haunts every civilization that has ever dared to call itself great, is this. Will we be wiser than Rome? Will we learn from its fatal mistake? Will we choose unity when division seems easier, strength when weakness seems safer, the hard path when the easy path beckons? Or will we, like Rome, divide ourselves to save ourselves, only to discover that in doing so, we have destroyed the very thing we sought to preserve? The choice, as always, is ours. But the consequences, as Rome learned too late, are eternal. Thank you for walking this long road through history with me tonight. May we all choose more wisely than the Romans did. May we all remember that unity is strength, division is death, and the greatest empires fall not to their enemies, but to their own fatal mistakes. Until we meet again in the shadows of history, remember, the past is prologue, the future is unwritten, and the choices we make today will echo through the centuries, just as Rome's choices echo still. Sleep well, dream of unity, and may we never forget the price of division. Good night.